Hey y'all beautiful people, welcome to this channel's very first video. I'm Pretzelis, and I am so excited to bring to you my experience with my first true love, Warframe. Seeing as this is my first video, a new series shall rise from the dust alongside it, Harmonious builds. In this series, I'll be narrowing my focus to one particular aspect of Warframe's buildcraft, whether it is a weapon, augment, companion, warframe, or even a strange and fun synergy between any number of existing mechanics. In everything I do, I always work to maximize enjoyment with expression and minimize boredom with unique, thrilling, and thematic builds. However, I encourage you to use these loadouts more as an inspiration rather than as an unchangeable meta of sorts. With all that said, let's move on with this first installment of Harmonious Builds. It's no secret that the changes brought to Warframe with its Melee 3.0 overhaul made its most diverse and numerous weapon class even more powerful. It follows that the Wraith version of the Furax are no different. But even considering that, these fists still have a number of pseudo-hidden attributes that are often overlooked for those who weren't around when that update was released. For those who don't know, all the parts for the Furax Wraith are obtained from Tier 5 Cetus bounties. They require a Mastery rank of 9 to craft. And with that out of the way, let's look at the stats. The Furax Wraith, at first glance, are truly a monster when it comes to crit. They have a base 30% critical chance, which is unrivaled by many melee weapons, and their crit multiplier is also sky high at 2.7 times. Their damage is also not too bad, with 139 base damage, most of it in impact, but the rest evenly split between slash and puncture. They also even have a decent status chance at 15%. This allows them to build for Weeping Wounds or the hybrid status mons at least somewhat reliably. Glazing over all the other somewhat extraneous stats it has that all melee weapons have, however, and you might notice something off. The Furax Wraith is actually one of only 2 weapons in Warframe with innate initial combo count, with the other being the Fragor Prime. We will get back to this, but it essentially makes him incredibly potent with heavy attacks, especially with Corrupt Charge. As well, another good stat to note about these weapons is follow-through, which was added in the Melee 3.0 update some time ago. Essentially, follow-through modifies the damage a melee weapon does when it hits 2 or more targets with one swing, with each instance of damage per enemy struck being modified by the follow-through value. Essentially, it means that with each additional enemy struck per swing, you'll be doing less damage. The thing to note here about the Furax Wraith, however, is that they have a follow-through value of 0.9, which is the highest of all non-exalted melee weapons in the game, next to all daggers, sparring weapons, and other fists. This means that, if given enough range, these weapons can actually do really serviceable AoE damage, despite being fists. Of course, as I just alluded to, the great weaknesses of these weapons is their range and their attack speed, which sits at 1.25 meters and 1.08 respectively. So you'll probably want a mob with range to damage enemies more reliably, and you'll probably want some sort of external attack speed buffing ability or arcane to assist in making your final build more usable. After a number of months playing with these weapons and loving them, I have today settled on a few unique loadouts that utilize them to their full potential, which, for me, always involves punching the living shit out of every enemy I encounter, and often with as much AoE clear as possible using the follow-through of the weapon. I also try to take every reasonable precaution in my build to stay alive, as long as it doesn't compromise my offense too much. With all that said, let's get into our first Harmonious build. As a die-hard VALKYR main, it's only natural that the first build I show revolves around the tankiness and melee power of VALKYR Prime. Here I opted for a Kubrow companion and the full suite of mecha set mods to make the most out of my pet. It doesn't really matter for me which Kubrow I use because I'm mostly running a Kubrow here not for their abilities, but for the insane tankiness that VALKYR can give them with Link Health and Link Armor, as well as the ridiculous status chance that Mecha Overdrive can grant if I use the Kubo Chrome as a stat stick. Also, because I'm running Hunter Recovery to heal my frame, I use the Bite and Maul damage mods. This way, I almost never die as long as I'm paying attention, even on Steel Path Moth Survival, where the enemies deal 200% increased damage on top of their levels. To top off the Kubro build, I finally run Prime Pack Leader and a ranked 4 Animal Instinct, and Fetch of course. I opted for a fully ranked Prime Pack Leader just in case I run up against heavily armored enemies and therefore have trouble keeping my pet alive. One thing to note here is you may notice that if my pet dies, I die, as my pet is the only thing giving me consistent, chunky healing with this build. Therefore, I will always opt to revive my pet above all else if it gets down. With that out of the way, let's move to the Warframe itself, the lovely VALKYR Prime. Yeah, there are 3 Umbral Formers here. Why? Well, she's my favorite frame, and as you can see, I love experimenting with lots of builds with her, so it was really worth it for me. Of course, if you don't want to invest in those chunky Umbra Formas, you can always replace Umbral Vitality, Fiber, and Intensify with their non-Umbral versions, or even D-rank versions you could buy out of Cephalon Samaris. So, with this build, I went for full survivability, as VALKYR herself has all the tools necessary to wreak havoc with any strong melee weapon, and I do love bolstering her insane base armor value with even more armor. A fully buffed Umbral Fiber with Carnus Carapace grants an insanely beefy 2,467 armor. That's 89.2% damage reduction, so yeah, not much will kill you outside of high-level Void missions, especially with Arcane Grace added into the mix. In addition to that, with a fully buffed Umbral Vitality as well as Carnus Carapace and Gladiator Resolve, I can achieve 1,340 health, which feeds back nicely both into my high armor and Arcane Grace, meaning an insane amount of effective HP. In fact, I think this is pretty close to a build that has the highest effective health any Warframe can achieve with just base stats, especially once you factor in the occasional Mecha Pulse proc. I also run Hunter Adrenaline. It's pretty much a no-brainer with this build, since I'll be tanking primarily with my health, and I'm going to need all the energy I can get if I want to spam Ember's Fire Blast, which I infused over Ripline. When infused, Fire Blast strips 75% armor in an AoE, which is perfect for this build since the Furax Wraith don't really have that many build options available for dealing with armor. I top off the build by dealing with one of the Furax Wraith's main weaknesses, attack speed. I fix that with the Eternal War Augment, which allows me to refresh Warcry's attack speed and armor buff with melee kills, and Arcane Strike, which grants a pretty hefty attack speed buff on its own. Finally, you'll see here that I opted for Maglev in the Exilus slot. I did this because I don't really need enemy radar, my pet is providing that, and I learned through testing that you can slide while executing heavy attacks, allowing you to hit more targets at once, and therefore really take advantage of the Furax Wraith's awesome follow-through. Moving out to the rest of the loadout, as I already mentioned, I'm using the Kuva Comb as a stat stick for my Kubro, taking advantage of its insane primary weapon status chance with mods like Shotgun Stabby and the 60/60 Elemental mods. I also threw in Amalgam Shotgun Spaz to revive my pet faster, and some Hunter mods to allow my pet to deal more damage when it procs Slash, which will be very often. The secondary weapon here can really be anything in my opinion, but I personally love using the Akjagar Prime because I can comfortably fit Karna's Stinger on them to gain the set bonus, and still use them as viable endgame weapons. The build here outside of Karna's Stinger is pretty standard. You got Horned Strike for damage, Amalgam Barrel Diffusion for multi-shot and dodge speed, Lethal Torrent for fire rate and multi-shot, Prime Target Cracker and Prime Pistol Gamut for crit damage and crit chance, and then Viral with the 60/60 mods, or Riven with 1 Toxin or Cold damage as one of its stats. Finally, I like to run Eject Magazine in the Exilus slot because, well, this build still revolves around the Furax Wraith, and I will really only need to be pulling out these pistols to shoot enemies at range or pop nullifier bubbles. Moving back to the loadout overview, I should mention that I rarely, if ever, use VALKYR's Talons unless I'm in a very dire situation and need the invincibility and healing. As you'll see, the Furax Wraith with a full build will easily outdamage VALKYR's Talons with the current setup I have, so they're mostly only an emergency option. For the Focus School, I usually go with MADURAI, since I gain a passive physical and elemental damage increase with Phoenix Talons and Phoenix Spirit. Void Strike is also quite a nice bonus to have when I'm ever in the business of using my Operator. And finally, we arrive at this loadout's take on the Furax Wraith. As I've been alluding to throughout this video so far, the Furax Wraith shine most as heavy attacking weapons due to their innate initial combo count stat and their awesome crit stats. Because of that, every Furax Wraith configuration shown in this video will be a variant of a heavy attack build. For the build itself, first we have our heavy attack essentials, Killing Blow and Amalgam Organ Shatter for the heavy attack wind-up speed and extra damage and crit damage. Then you'll see that I opted for the 2 sacrificial mods for added damage and a massive amount of crit, which is doubled on heavy attacks. Finally, the main part of the build is complete with Corrupt Charge, which will grant an extra 30 initial combo count at the cost of minus 50 base combo duration. You'll see here that I have a Riven, which itself is already insanely useful for these weapons due to their very, very high Riven disposition. I was fortunate enough to roll Furax Cooperative, which gives a huge amount of initial combo, crit chance, and range at the cost of damage to Grineer. This is actually pretty close to the perfect God roll Riven. All I'd need to top it off would be a useless negative like minus combo duration instead of minus damage to Grineer. But as you'll see, even against 99% of Grineer, this weapon decimates them due to its stratospheric crit chance values. With every heavy attack, I pound the enemy with a massive red crit. Also, thanks to the initial combo, I'm always sitting in a natural 5 times combo multiplier with this weapon, which, frankly, is nuts. If you don't have a Riven, I recommend replacing it with Prime Reach for the range. Trust me, it'll be worth it. With the base build out of the way, we'll move on to the 2 option slots, which for me usually include an Elemental mod and Weeping Wounds to proc status on heavy attacks with my initial 5 times multiplier. In this case, I opt for Molten Impact for heat damage, as heat is probably the most versatile and powerful single element in Warframe right now, thanks to its armor strip and dot on status effect. Also, it's worth noting that thanks to the Mecha Set bonus, if I kill a marked target with an attack that also procs heat with this build, the huge dot damage will also be transferred to all enemies within 30 meters, usually causing a massive AoE nuke. It doesn't happen all the time, even with Weeping Wounds, since I end up with a 39% status chance, but still, it's a great bonus to have. It's worth noting that I am only using Weeping Wounds because of my Riven, which allows me to reach a combo count of 83 at base. If you don't have an initial combo count Riven, I'd recommend slotting either more elemental damage or something like Berserker if you want some more attack speed. The culmination of this build is a powerful Warframe plus Kubro combo with nearly immovable health values and massive single impact damage with the Furax Wraith. I have so much fun with this build, mainly because I love fulfilling the Rock'em Sock'em tank fantasy in Warframe, and VALKYR allows me to do that beautifully while equipped with these devastating gauntlets. A few other things about the build that surface primarily through gameplay are the 2 primary active set bonuses. The Max Mecha set is capable of spreading deadly heat procs, and the 2 out of 3 Karna set bonus consistently grants 4 seconds of status immunity and evasion as long as I keep bashing skulls in it. Fire Blast is also a godsend for this build, as not only does it strip armor, it also knocks down enemies, adding some decent crowd control in sticky situations. As I mentioned before, I generally only pull out my Actigara Prime to quickly pop nullifier bubbles so as to keep my Warcry active as long as I can. Energy economy is optimized thanks to Hunter Adrenaline. Thanks to the constant supply of energy, I don't often need to worry about using Fire Blast when the need arises. And with that, we conclude our first Harmonious build with Furax Wraith, Feral Ascension. Next up is a build featuring one of my longtime favorites, Zephyr. Zephyr is, to be sure, a quirky case when it comes to how her power is expressed through her abilities. At first glance, it might seem that she's a bit overloaded in the mobility department, but as you'll see, she's also capable of some very great damage dealing with the right modding, and even some very serviceable survivability. Moving on to my Zephyr Prime build, you'll see that I mostly have ability modifying mods in place of survivability, thanks to the pseudo cheat code for staying alive that Turbulence is. The rest of the config buffs my shield recharge values, since Turbulence doesn't protect against specific attacks, like melee, and I therefore realized I needed to make use of her shield gating as much as I can in case I get blasted through my wind barrier. With all that said, you'll see that I opted for Funnel Clouds because of its great synergy with hard-hitting attacks, which the Furax Wraith will provide. When equipped, this mod will cause your tornadoes to spawn in larger numbers at the cost of being smaller and no longer ragdolling enemies. Because of the tornado's property of spreading damage to engulfed enemies when I strike, this allows me to deal some wild AoE damage as long as I keep punching my tornadoes when they're near enemies. To support funnel clouds, I opted for narrow-minded and prime continuity for a huge amount of duration. This will allow me to keep my tornadoes and turbulence up longer, as well as give me a huge amount of mobility with tailwind. I used stretch and cunning drift to offset the range decrease from narrow-minded, and natural talent to make sure I'm always able to cast turbulence quickly when its duration expires. Cunning drift also adds some slide, which as I've said during the previous build is quite a useful stat for the Furax Wraith. Fast deflection and fortitude round out the build with some useful shield recharge, and you'll see that I use swift momentum in the aura to make my heavy attacks come out faster. Arcane Energize is a useful addition to this build as well, as I'll be casting a lot of my turbulence and tornadoes. Arcane Strike is there for some much needed attack speed, and as a final touch I use Anchor Glide in the Exilus slot because, well, I often find that with this build, Zephyr's passive often only gets in the way of what I want to do. As a final note, you'll see that I infuse Master Summons over Airburst. I did this because I am using a Raxacubro to bolster my shield regeneration and shield gating for emergencies, and Master Summons allows me to keep it alive and revive it when I need to. Let's move on to Tharos, my Raxacubro. Unlike the previous build, where I could rely on Link Health and Link Armor to grant my pet insane tankiness, that isn't the case here since Zephyr on her own is incredibly squishy. So, I try to make the fullest use out of the Raxacubro's crowd control ability Howl and shield restoration ability Protect to keep both of us alive in hairy situations. Besides that, I run Hunter Recovery in case I need some healing, Bite and Maul for damage, Link Shields and Link Health for more defenses, Hasten Deflection for more shield recharge, and finally the utility mods Primed Animal Instinct and Fetch for Radar and Vacuum. You'll see that even with these mods, it isn't enough to keep Tharos alive, but that's why I use Master Summons to revive or heal him in case he gets in trouble. Moving out to the build overview, you'll find that the primary and secondary weapons here really make little difference, as I rarely use them outside of ranged utility. However, I make sure to use Zeneric as my focus school because I'm always going to need energy for flying around and casting all of my very expensive abilities. And as for the Furax Wraith build here, you'll see that it's the exact same as with Feral Ascension, but instead of the added heat elemental, I opted for electricity. I did this because the status effect of electricity, Tesla Chain, has some ridiculous AoE damage potential when paired with funnel clouds. Since Zephyr's tornadoes can not only distribute damage but also status effects, it allows my electricity proccing punches to transfer lightning in a large area, affecting more enemies and causing a damage multiplied chain reaction. In its finality, this build is another Warframe plus Kubro combo, but one that is focused more on dealing damage instead of taking it. It's important to remember that Turbulence doesn't work for every situation, as all it does is deflect projectiles. That said, you'll be quite healthy and immune to most forms of damage in most missions as long as you keep Turbulence up. Thanks to the insane duration I'm building for here, this build is also my go-to for free roam landscape missions, since I don't even need to use Archwing to get from place to place thanks to Tailwind. Zenuric and Arcane Energize sate my energy hunger for the most part, and thanks to my shield recharge mods and Protect from my Kubro, I can stay alive very well even against attacks that bypass my turbulence, like the Deimos Jugulus' ground spine attack. And when it comes to the punching, man, is it satisfying. With each punch tornado, I'm able to fry and pulverize every engulfed enemy thanks to the damage multiplication of my tornadoes and the AoE chain reaction of the electricity status effect. Since my tornadoes multiply critical damage by 2 instead of 1, I'm able to project the power of the Furax Wraith across a large area for even more damage. And that, my friends, is the second Harmonious build for the Furax Wraith, Cyclone Servitor. And for our final Harmonious build, something different. This build features RHINO Prime with a rather strange modding setup, made in the interest of supporting the Furax Wraith as its ultimate weapon. This configuration is a bit more technical than the others, and also far more difficult to play and keep alive, but I've found that once the player at the helm knows what to do, it's incredibly satisfying to play. Starting off, here we have the unshakable RHINO Prime. At first glance, this build may seem fringe, ineffective, or even insane, but after a lot of testing, I found that it's actually very good at achieving total area lockdown so enemies can be punched to death, while also keeping itself alive, even against high-level void enemies. If you couldn't already tell, the main sacrifice of this build is Iron Skin. Normally, most players opt to rocket Iron Skin's ferrite armor values to huge levels with Ironclad Charge, but here I've chosen to take the nutty approach of exposing RHINO's health more in order to take advantage of Hunter Adrenaline to generate energy in emergencies. Thanks to the invincibility phase that Iron Skin grants, where damage taken is added to its health, I can pair it with natural talent to instantly refresh it once it goes down. Prime Flow and Streamline add to Rhino Prime's naturally low energy economy, so I can cast all the abilities I need, and Vitality and Saxtum Carapace add some much needed health and armor, as well as the Saxtum set bonus, which I have maxed across my loadout. Piercing Roar is actually quite useful for this build because it allows me to knock down enemies and affect them with puncture procs, reducing their damage so my Iron Skin can be more effective. Also, Piercing Roar has a nice synergy with Rhino Stomp. With this mod equipped, I can cast Roar first, knock enemies down, and then use Stomp to slow time, causing all enemies around me to be locked to the ground for 8 seconds. This is a nice form of CC that allows me to go to town with the Furax Wraith during its duration. To round out the build, I infused Ember's Fire Blast on top of Rhino Charge to strip armor, and to allow me to use the Healing Flame Augment as a reliable way to top off my health. Arcane Energize is always welcome with this build, as I am always casting abilities, and Arcane Strike adds some much needed attack speed for my gauntlets. Cunning Drift is in the extra slot for some slide and range, and finally, the build is crowned by Brief Respite, which resets my shield gate whenever I cast abilities, giving me some time to recast Iron Skin in case I'm in a dangerous situation. Moving on to the build overview, I make sure to use rapid-firing ranged weapons to deal with nullifier bubbles whenever I see them, as they are one of the main counters to the ability-centered playstyle of this build. I also use them to proc impact on enemies, allowing me to use Parazon finishers on them. The Parazon is quite useful for this build due to the incidental energy it can grant thanks to Blood for Energy. And so, to support my Parazon, I make sure to slot in impact mods onto my ranged weapons, which in this case are an impact-based Kuva Karak and the Twin Gorkatas. Tactical Reload and Eject Magazine also help me to efficiently weave Furax Wraith punches between shooting specific enemies for Parazon finishers. Zenurik is here because more energy is always needed, and as for the Furax Wraith build, it's fairly standard besides using a hybrid of Impact and Heat with Saxum Thorax and Volcanic Edge. Finally, I opted to use Jinn as my companion because with its exclusive Reawaken mod, it can revive itself after 90 seconds whenever it dies. This allows me to take it comfortably into long endurance runs, so I pretty much always have access to the enemy radar and vacuum it grants. Overall, I love this build, not because it is the most powerful thing out there, but because it's fun and interactive with its mechanics and playstyle. When the enemies get beefy and damaging, I have to be on my toes if I want to stay alive, and when I do, I'm rewarded with the insane damage of my Furax Wraith on armor-stripped enemies and explosions galore from the Saxon mod set, each of which deal 30% of the health of slain enemies in a 6-meter radius. Enemies are locked down constantly for my abilities, and I'm able to sustain myself well with Healing Flame. I learned to immediately cast Iron Skin whenever I hear my shields being down, and also to always keep Zenurik's Energizing Dash active as much as possible so I can always at least cast Iron Skin in dire straits. With this build, I've also become comfortable making use of energy restores, since I'm always casting abilities and more energy is always welcome. It's important to note as well that even though I'm showing solo footage to demonstrate the power of this build, I almost never use it that way in regular gameplay. Warframe is a squad-based game after all. And that concludes the final loadout for this installment of Harmonious builds, Star Shaker Titan. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I hope these builds spark some new ideas to make Warframe more fun for both the veteran and newbie alike. Cheers, and here's to a life full of happy surprises.